The starship Resolute Dawn floated in the cold darkness of space, far from Earth and far from anything that felt like home. It was a massive vessel, built to carry fighters and soldiers across the galaxy. Thousands of beings lived and worked inside its metal walls. Humans, Helix engineers, and others moved through its corridors every day. And somewhere in the lowest levels, in a place most people never thought about, the servants worked in silence. Was one of them. She was a dragonkin from a world called Prime. Her people had once been proud. They had flown through crimson skies and built cities on mountain peaks. They had songs and stories and dreams. But that was before the war, before the treaty, before her world became a conquered place and her people became property. Now worked in the maintenance hangars of the Resolute Dawn. She was small for her kind, standing only 7 feet tall. Her scales were the color of ash, dull and faded from years without proper sunlight. She had wings folded tight against her back, but she was not allowed to open them. Servants did not fly. Servants did not do anything except work. Every morning, woke in a small room she shared with 11 other dragonkin. They slept on thin mats on the floor. They ate whatever scraps were given to them. They spoke little because there was little to say. Then they went to their stations and worked until they were told to stop. Station was Bay 7, deep in the belly of the ship where the fighter craft were stored and repaired. The air there smelled of fuel and hot metal. The lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a pale yellow glow. Machines hummed and clanked at all hours. It was loud and dirty and exhausting, but had learned to disappear into the noise. She kept her head down. She did her tasks. She tried not to think. Her job was simple but endless. She scrubbed carbon scoring from the hulls of fighters that came back from missions. She cleared fuel lines and cleaned engine parts. She hauled heavy equipment from one end of the bay to the other. Her hands were rough and cracked. Her back ached constantly, but she never complained. Complaining only brought punishment. The beings who ran the ship barely noticed her. To the officers with their gleaming carapaces and clicking mandibles, she was just another beast of burden. To the Helix engineers with their 4 arms and cold eyes, she was a tool that happened to breathe. Even most humans walked past her without a second glance. She was part of the background, like the pipes on the walls or the grates on the floor. But not everyone was blind. Danny had worked in starship hangars for 15 years. He was a lead mechanic, responsible for keeping the fighters in Bay 7 ready to fly. He was in his late 30s, with calloused hands and tired eyes that had seen too much. He did not talk much. He did not make friends easily, but he was good at his job, and part of being good meant noticing things that others missed. Danny noticed loose rivets before they became problems. He heard sounds that should not be there. He saw hairline fractures that could turn into disasters. And sometimes, when he walked through his bay on his routine inspections, he noticed the servants too. He had seen many times over the past months. He knew which corner she usually worked in. He knew she was quiet and quick and never caused trouble. He did not know her name or her story, but he saw her. That was more than most people could say. Danny's crew was small but reliable. There was his apprentice, a young woman in her 20s who asked too many questions but learned fast. There was Pete, loud and friendly, always cracking jokes to keep the mood light. And there was Ben, steady and careful, the kind of person you wanted checking your work before a launch. Together they kept Bay 7 running. They fixed what was broken. They maintained what was working. They prepared the fighters for pilots who rarely thanked them and officers who only noticed them when something went wrong. It was not glamorous work, but it mattered. Danny believed that. Every bolt he tightened, every system he checked, kept someone alive out there in the black. That belief kept him going through the long shifts and the thankless days. The week the story truly begins was harder than most. The fleet was preparing for a major joint operation with the Dominion. It was supposed to be a show of strength, a reminder to the rest of the galaxy that the alliance between humans and was solid. Dozens of fighters needed to be ready. Deadlines were tight. Tempers were short. The hangar was chaos from morning to night. Pilots rushed to briefings and back again. Supply drones weaved between scaffolding, carrying parts and ammunition. Officers barked orders that echoed off the metal walls. Everyone moved with purpose. Everyone had somewhere to be. In the middle of all this noise and motion, worked in her corner near a decommissioned shuttle. She was away from the main activity, away from the eyes of those who might watch too closely. She had been assigned extra duties that week as punishment for moving too slowly on a previous task. A supervisor had decided she needed to learn discipline. So she worked double shifts. She slept 2 or 3 hours a night when she was lucky. She ate half rations because the extra food had been taken away. Her body screamed for rest, but she kept moving. She had no choice. On the 4th day, her hands began to shake. On the 5th day, her vision blurred at the edges, but she told herself to hold on. The operation would launch soon. The pressure would ease. She just had to survive until then. She did not know that everything was about to change. She did not know that someone was finally going to see her. And she did not know that a quiet mechanic in Bay 7 was about to do something that would shake the entire fleet. But first, the worst news of her life was coming. And when it arrived, she would learn just how alone she really was in this cold metal world so far from home. The stars outside the ship burned bright and distant, indifferent to the suffering within. But somewhere in the universe, there were still people who cared, just had not met them yet. The message came through the servant channels early that morning, passed from one dragonkin to another in whispers and quiet glances. It traveled through the lower decks like smoke, finding those it was meant to find. When it reached, she was already at her station, scrubbing a fuel intake valve with hands that had not stopped shaking for days. Another servant approached her, an older male with wings and eyes that had long ago stopped hopping. He leaned close and spoke 3 words in their native tongue. Then he walked away without waiting for a response. Stood very still. The words repeated in her mind over and over until they stopped making sense, until they became just sounds without meaning. Because if she let them mean something, she would break apart right there on the hangar floor. Her clutch sister was dead. They had been born from the same nest, hatched on the same day under the same red sun. They had learned to fly together, tumbling through warm winds above the crystal forests of Prime. When the war came and their world fell, they had held each other in the dark transport ships and promised to survive. When they were separated and sent to different parts of the galaxy, they had sworn to find each other again someday. Now there would be no someday. Had died in the labor camps back on there. The message did not say how, but knew. She had heard the stories, worked to death, starved, beaten for being too slow or too tired or simply for existing. The camps were designed to extract every last bit of usefulness from the conquered before discarding what remained. Her sister had been 23 years old. Wanted to scream. She wanted to tear at the metal walls with her claws and roar her grief until the whole ship heard. She wanted to find the who had done this and make them understand what they had taken from her. But she could do none of those things. Dragon servants were not permitted emotional displays. They were not permitted to stop working. They were not permitted to be anything other than quiet, obedient tools. If she screamed, she would be punished. If she stopped working, she would be punished. If anyone saw her crying, she would be punished. So did the only thing she could do. She returned to her task and let the tears fall in silence. The hangar around her continued as if nothing had happened, because for everyone else, nothing had happened. The operation was still approaching. The deadlines were still pressing. The chaos was still churning through Bay 7 like a storm that never ended. Pilots rushed past her on their way to briefings. They talked loudly about the mission, about glory and honor and the enemies they would face. They did not see the scaled figure crouched in the corner, shoulders trembling with suppressed sobs. Supply drones hummed overhead, carrying parts and ammunition. Their sensors did not register grief. Their programming did not account for a breaking heart. They simply moved around her and continued their routes. Officers walked through the bay, checking preparations and shouting orders. One of them, a human lieutenant with a data pad, stopped a few feet from to review some figures. He frowned at the screen, muttered something about fuel consumption rates and moved on. He never once looked at her. The chief engineer, a tall named, conducted his inspection of the fighter craft lined up for launch clearance. He moved with precise, clicking steps, his mandibles twitching as he examined each vessel. When he reached the fighter beside, he paused. For one terrible moment, she thought he had seen her tears. She thought he would demand an explanation. She thought everything was about to get worse. But simply turned to his subordinate and said, in a voice loud enough for her to hear, "At least the beasts are quiet workers. They know their place better than some species I could name." His subordinate made a clicking sound that might have been laughter. Then they moved on, leaving alone with her grief and the casual cruelty of his words still ringing in her ears. She scrubbed the same panel over and over, her movements mechanical and empty. The tears kept coming, sliding down her scaled face and dripping onto the metal floor. She did not wipe them away. It would have required her to stop working, and she could not stop. She must not stop. Walked past on her way to collect a diagnostic tool. She glanced toward the corner and saw hunched over her work. For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. A question, a concern, but the moment passed. She had her own tasks to complete, her own deadlines to meet. She told herself the dragon was probably fine. Servants always looked miserable. It did not mean anything was wrong. Pete's laughter echoed through the bay as he joked with another technician about weekend plans. They talked about a game they wanted to watch and food they wanted to eat, and all the small pleasures that made life bearable. Their voices were bright and careless, full of a freedom that had forgotten existed. She had not had a weekend in 3 years. She had not watched anything or eaten anything that was not required for survival. She had not laughed since the day her world fell silent. Ben passed by without looking up from his data pad. He was focused on a calibration problem, running numbers in his head and frowning at the results. Good work required concentration. Distractions were dangerous. The figure in the corner was just part of the scenery, no more important than the pipes or the grates. And so the hours passed. The operation grew closer. The pressure grew greater, and remained in her corner, invisible and alone, drowning in a grief that no one bothered to see. Then Danny began his routine inspection. He walked slowly through Bay 7, checking each station and each craft with the careful attention he gave to everything. His eyes moved over familiar sights, looking for anything out of place. A loose panel, a forgotten tool, a warning light that should not be blinking. He was almost at the end of his rounds when he paused. Something felt wrong, not with the equipment or the fighters but with the air itself, a heaviness he could not explain. Danny turned toward the corner where the decommissioned shuttle sat waiting for parts that would never come. He saw the scaled servant crouched beside it, scrubbing a panel with jerky, desperate movements. He saw the trembling in her shoulders. He saw the way her head hung low, as if carrying a weight too heavy to bear. He saw the tears. For a long moment, Danny stood there, watching what everyone else had ignored. Then he began to walk toward her, not knowing that his next words would change everything. Not knowing that sometimes, the simplest question is the most powerful thing in the universe. Not knowing that seeing someone, truly seeing them, is the first step toward saving them. Danny approached slowly, keeping his footsteps soft against the metal floor. He had worked around enough alien species to know that sudden movements could frighten or threaten. He did not want to scare her. He just wanted to understand what he was seeing. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he stopped. The dragon's servant had not noticed him yet. She was still scrubbing the same panel, her clawed hands moving in circles that accomplished nothing. Her whole body shook with quiet sobs that she was trying desperately to hide. Danny crouched down beside her, lowering himself to her level. He waited until she sensed his presence and looked up. Her eyes were large and golden, rimmed with red from crying. They widened with fear when she saw him. She tried to speak, to apologize, to get back to work. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She expected punishment. She expected anger. She expected the same cold indifference that every other being on this ship had shown her. Instead, Danny asked quietly, "Hey, you okay?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him, unable to process what she had heard. No one had asked her that question in 3 years of service. No one had looked at her face and seen anything worth asking about. No one had treated her like she might have feelings that mattered. Her carefully built walls began to crack. "I asked if you're okay," Danny repeated, his voice gentle, "because you don't look okay to me." Tried to pull herself together. She tried to say that she was fine, that she would work harder, that she was sorry for whatever offense she had caused. That was what she was supposed to say. That was how servants survived. But the words would not come. Instead, other words came pouring out. Words she had held inside for so long that they burned her throat on the way up. She told him about the message, about her clutch sister, who had died in the labor camps that very morning, about how they had been born together and separated together and promised to find each other again, about how that promise was now broken forever because her sister was gone and nothing would ever bring her back. She told him about Prime, about the red sun and the crystal forests and the mountain cities where her people had lived for thousands of years, about the war that came without warning and the treaty that turned freedom into memory, about being loaded onto transport ships and scattered across the galaxy like seeds in a storm. She told him about the work, the endless, crushing work that started before dawn and ended after midnight, the double shifts assigned as punishment for imaginary failures, the rations cut in half because a supervisor decided she was eating too much, the sleep she had not gotten in days because there was always more to do. She told him about the rules: no speaking unless spoken to, no stopping unless told to stop, no emotional displays of any kind, no opening her wings, no lifting her head, no being anything other than a tool that happened to breathe. And she told him about the loneliness, the terrible, crushing loneliness of being surrounded by thousands of beings and seen by none of them, the loneliness of having no one to talk to, no one to share memories with, no one who cared whether she lived or died, the loneliness of losing her last connection to home and having no one to mourn with. When she finished, her voice was raw and her eyes were empty. She waited for Danny to tell her that none of this mattered. She waited for him to order her back to work. She waited for the brief illusion of being heard to shatter like all illusions eventually did. Danny sat in silence for a long moment. His jaw was tight. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hard. "That's not right," he said. "None of that is right." Blinked at him, confused. She did not understand what he meant. This was how things were. This was how they had always been. The strong ruled and the weak served. That was the way of the galaxy. But Danny shook his head. "I don't care what some treaty says. I don't care what the think servants are supposed to be. You're a person. You're hurting. And what's happening to you is wrong." He asked her more questions then. How long since she had slept properly? How long since she had eaten a full meal? How long since anyone had treated her with basic dignity? The answers made him angrier with each word. 2 days without sleep. A week without proper food. 3 years without kindness. Danny stood up. His eyes moved across the hangar, taking in the rows of fighters waiting for launch clearance. Dozens of craft that could not fly without his approval. Millions of credits worth of military hardware that depended on his judgment and his signature. He thought about the operation coming up, the political importance, the pressure from command, the alliance with the that everyone said was essential for humanity's survival. Then he thought about the dragon girl sitting on the floor, crying because her sister was dead, and no one in the entire galaxy seemed to care. He thought about what kind of person he wanted to be, what kind of humanity he wanted to represent. The decision was not hard. It should have been hard, but it was not, because some things were more important than missions and alliances and politics. Some things were worth stopping everything for. "Stay here," Danny told. "I need to do something." He walked to his station with long, purposeful strides. His crew watched him pass, sensing that something had changed. Called out a question, but he did not answer. Pete made a joke that fell flat in the sudden silence. Ben looked up from his data pad with concern in his eyes. Danny sat down at his terminal and entered his authorization codes. His fingers moved across the interface with the confidence of years of practice. One by one, he flagged every fighter in Bay 7 as unsafe for launch. Maintenance hold, pending inspection, not cleared for operation. Without his clearance, nothing in this bay would fly. The whole operation would grind to a halt until he said otherwise. Warning lights began to flash, alarms began to sound, officers began to shout. And Danny, lead mechanic of Bay 7, leaned back in his chair and waited for the storm to arrive. He knew what was coming. He knew there would be consequences. He knew his career, his freedom, maybe even his life might be at stake. But when he looked back at, still crouched in her corner with tears drying on her scales, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt like he was finally doing something that mattered. The alarms brought chaos like a wave crashing against rocks. Red lights pulsed along the ceiling of Bay 7. Alert messages scrolled across every screen. Voices rose in confusion and anger as officers realized what had happened. The fighters were grounded, all of them. Every single craft in the bay showed the same status: maintenance hold, pending inspection, not cleared for launch. Commander Nora Vance arrived within minutes. She was the human liaison to the fleet command, responsible for keeping the alliance smooth and the mission on schedule. She was a tall woman with hair cut short and eyes that had weathered 100 crises. But even she looked shaken as she pushed through the crowd of technicians and officers gathered near Danny's station. "What is going on here?" she demanded. "Who locked down this bay?" Danny stood to meet her. His face was calm, his voice steady. "I did, Commander." Vance stared at him like he had lost his mind. "You did? Do you have any idea what you've done? The operation launches in 8 hours. We have 3 squadrons depending on this bay. If those fighters don't fly, the entire formation falls apart." "I understand that, Commander." "Then explain yourself, now." Before Danny could answer, another figure pushed through the crowd. The chief engineer clicked his way to the front with his subordinates close behind. His compound eyes gleamed with fury, and his mandibles twitched in patterns that Danny had learned to recognize as threat displays. "This is sabotage," hissed. "This human has deliberately compromised the joint operation. He should be arrested immediately and turned over to Dominion military police." "Nobody is getting turned over anywhere until I understand what's happening," Vance said sharply. She turned back to Danny. "Talk fast." Danny pointed toward the corner where, still crouched, frozen in place by the sudden attention of so many powerful beings. "It's about her." Every eye in the hangar turned to look at the dragon servant. She pressed herself against the shuttle behind her, trying to make herself smaller. Her scales had gone pale with fear. Vance frowned. "The servant, what about her?" Danny explained. He told them about the double shifts, the rations, the deliberate abuse disguised as discipline. He told them about the 2 days without sleep and the week without proper food. He told them about the sister who had died that morning in the labor camps, and the crying girl that everyone had walked past without a second glance. "Under Earth Union labor codes," Danny continued, "what's happening to her constitutes criminal negligence. Those codes apply to all personnel on human vessels, including indentured workers. I'm invoking safety protocols until proper working conditions are established. Made a sound of disgust. This is absurd. It's a servant, a dragon. They are property under the terms of the treaty. Human laws do not apply to beasts. She's not on a ship, Danny replied. She's on a human ship, my bay, and in my bay she's a person with rights. You would endanger the entire alliance for this. Stepped closer, looming over Danny with his frame. You would risk everything your species has built with the Dominion for one worthless creature. Danny met his compound eyes without flinching. I would, and I am. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Everyone in the hangar understood what was at stake. The alliance between humans and was fragile, built on mutual need more than mutual respect. They had numbers and territory. The humans had adaptability and determination. Together, they formed a coalition that kept the darker powers of the galaxy at bay. If this situation escalated, that coalition could crack. If the crack spread, it could shatter. And if it shattered, no one knew what would happen next. Commander Vance felt the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. She was a practical woman. She understood politics and compromise and the ugly math of survival. Every instinct told her to order Danny to stand down, to smooth things over with, to sacrifice one servant girl for the sake of the greater good. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the look on Danny's face, the quiet certainty of someone who had found a line they would not cross. Maybe it was the memory of her own daughter, safe back on Earth because other people had made hard choices to protect what mattered. Or maybe it was something else, something deeper, something that had been sleeping inside her for a long time and was only now beginning to wake. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, something remarkable happened. Stepped forward, she walked across the hangar floor and stood beside Danny, her arms crossed over her chest. She did not speak. She did not need to. Pete followed a moment later. Then Ben. Then other mechanics from neighboring bays, people who had heard what was happening and come to see for themselves. One by one, they crossed the invisible line and joined Danny. A pilot appeared at the edge of the crowd. His name was Greg Heller, and he had flown rescue missions during the campaign. He had seen what they did to conquered worlds. He had carried survivors out of burning cities and buried friends who died trying to save people no one else would save. He walked to Danny's side and turned to face the officers. His uniform was still crisp from his mission briefing, but his eyes burned with something that had nothing to do with combat. More humans followed, technicians and pilots and support staff who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by standing there. They formed a wall around, a barrier of bodies between her and those who would call her property. Watched this with growing disbelief. His mandibles clicked rapidly, patterns of confusion and rage mixing together. "This is mutiny," he said. "This is insanity. Commander Vance, you must restore order immediately." Vance looked at the. She looked at the frozen fighters. She looked at the humans standing together in defiance of everything practical and political. And she looked at. The dragon girl had stopped trembling. She was staring at the wall of people who had gathered to protect her, and there was something in her golden eyes that had not been there before. Something fragile and precious and almost impossible to name. Hope. Commander Nora Vance made her choice. "Chief Engineer," she said, her voice carrying across the silent hangar, "I am invoking emergency human authority over labor conditions aboard this vessel. The servant designated is hereby removed from indentured service pending a full review of her treatment. Medical staff will examine her immediately. Any objection to this order can be filed through proper diplomatic channels." His mandibles went still. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious." Vance straightened her spine and met his compound eyes. "And I suggest you contact your superiors before you say anything else you might regret. The Dominion needs this alliance as much as we do, perhaps more. I doubt they want it damaged over the treatment of one servant." The standoff lasted another long moment, then turned and stalked away, his subordinates scurrying behind him. He would file protests. He would make threats. He would try to find ways to punish those who had him. But for now, for this moment, he had lost. Danny let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Around him, his fellow humans began to move again, talking quietly and clapping each other on shoulders. The crisis was not over, but the worst had passed. He walked back to, who was still staring at everything like she had woken into a dream. Tears were flowing down her scaled face again, but they were different tears now. "You're safe," Danny told her. "At least for now. We're going to get you to medical, get you some food and rest, and figure out what happens next." Opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached out one clawed hand and touched Danny's arm, gentle as a feather. It was the first time in 3 years that anyone had touched her without causing pain. And somewhere in the back of the hangar, Commander Vance watched and wondered if she had just changed the course of history. The medical bay was quiet compared to the hangar. Soft lights hummed overhead, and clean white walls reflected a calm that felt almost unreal after everything that had happened. Sat on an examination bed, wrapped in a blanket that was warmer than anything she had felt in years. A human doctor named Lisa Park had checked her over thoroughly. Malnutrition, exhaustion, multiple stress fractures in her hands from the endless scrubbing, early signs of organ damage from the poor diet and overwork. Nothing that could not be healed with proper care, but the doctor's face had been tight with anger as she documented each injury. 3 more months of this, Dr. Park had said quietly, and you would have been dead, just like your sister. Had no response to that. She had known she was dying. She had simply stopped caring somewhere along the way. Survival had become habit rather than hope, and habit was a fragile thing. But now things were different. Commander Vance had kept her word. An investigation was launched into the treatment of Dragonkin servants throughout the fleet. Reports came back within days, painting a picture of systematic abuse that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Double shifts, starvation rations, beatings for minor offenses, workers dying and being replaced without anyone bothering to count. The protested at every level, filed complaint after complaint with the Joint Command, arguing that humans had no right to interfere with the treatment of conquered species. The Dominion Diplomatic Corps sent sharp messages warning of consequences. But the humans held firm. It surprised everyone, including themselves. There had been plenty of reasons to back down. The alliance was valuable. The operation was important. The political costs were real. But something had shifted in the human delegation, something that started in Bay 7 and spread through the fleet like fire through dry grass. Word traveled fast in military circles. A human mechanic had stopped an entire operation for a crying servant girl, not for political advantage, not for strategic gain, because he saw her suffering and could not look away. The story reached other ships, other stations, other sectors. Humans who had never met Danny heard what he had done and felt something stir in their chests. Pride, perhaps, or recognition, or simply the reminder of who they wanted to be when the galaxy was watching. They did not understand it. Their reports described the incident as an inexplicable breakdown in human discipline, a failure of logic that they struggled to explain. To them, servants were tools. Tools did not require compassion. Tools did not deserve protection. The idea that anyone would sacrifice mission readiness for a single worthless creature was beyond their comprehension. But other species understood. A reptilian species that had watched humanity with careful attention since first contact convened an emergency council to discuss the implications. They had studied human weapons and tactics for decades, trying to understand what made this young species so dangerous. They had assumed it was aggression, adaptability, or some other military quality. They had been wrong. The council reviewed the reports from the Resolute Dawn. They analyzed the behavior of Danny, his crew, and the humans who had stood with him. They cross-referenced it with other incidents from human history, moments when humans had risked everything for strangers, for enemies, even for beings they had never met. And they reached a conclusion that changed their entire strategic outlook. Humans were not dangerous because of their weapons. They were dangerous because they cared. They cared not just for their own kind, but for anyone they decided was worth protecting. They made choices based on emotion and principle rather than pure calculation. They could not be predicted by logic alone because their logic included factors that other species did not account for. This made them unreliable allies and terrifying enemies. You could never be certain what a human would do, because you could never be certain what they would choose to care about. They transmitted a classified report to their council. The message was intercepted by human intelligence 3 weeks later. It read, "We have studied humanity for decades, seeking to understand what makes them dangerous. We focused on their weapons, their tactics, their aggression. We were wrong. Their true threat is something we did not anticipate. They care, not just for their own kind, but for anyone they deem worthy of protection. This makes them unpredictable. This makes them impossible to subjugate. This makes them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Recommend extreme caution in all future dealings." The message was shared among human leadership. Some laughed at it. Others felt the weight of it settle on their shoulders. A few, like Commander Vance, simply nodded and filed it away as confirmation of something they had always known. Knew nothing of galactic politics or intercepted transmissions. She only knew that for the first time in 3 years, she was sleeping in a real bed. She was eating real food. She was being treated like a person instead of a tool. And she was unfolding her wings. They were stiff from years of being pressed against her back, the membranes pale and thin from lack of use. The medical staff had encouraged her to stretch them, to rebuild the muscles that had atrophied during her captivity. The first time she extended them fully, filling the small medical bay with scaled wingspan, she had wept. Danny visited her every day. He brought food from the mess hall, real food, not servant rations. He brought news about the investigation and the changes being implemented across the fleet. He brought quiet company, sitting beside her bed and talking about ordinary things. His childhood on a colony world, his first job as a mechanic, the ships he had served on over the years. He never asked for gratitude. He never acted like he had done anything special. When tried to thank him, he just shrugged and said anyone would have done the same. She knew that was not true. She had seen how many people had walked past her without stopping. She had felt the weight of being invisible for 3 long years. "Why did you do it?" she asked him one evening as the stars turned slowly outside the viewport. "Why did you risk everything for me? You did not know me. I was just a servant." Danny was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. They were rough and calloused, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working with tools and machines. Hands that had done nothing but practical things until the day they flagged a fleet of fighters as unsafe because a girl was crying. "I don't know," he said finally. "I saw you there and you were hurting and nobody else seemed to notice. I kept thinking about what would happen if I just walked past like everyone else, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't be that person." He looked up at her, his tired eyes meeting her golden ones. "Someone should have done it a long time ago. Someone should have seen you before I did. I'm sorry it took so long." Reached out and took his hand. Her claws were careful against his skin, gentle in a way that her people had almost forgotten how to be. "You saw me," she said. "That is enough. That is more than enough." They sat together in the quiet of the medical bay, human and dragon, looking out at the stars that burned bright and distant in the endless dark. The galaxy was vast and cold and full of beings who would never understand what had happened in Bay 7. But understood, and she would remember. Somewhere out there, her still suffered under occupation. Her people still labored in camps and served in bondage. The war was not over and freedom was not won. But for the first time since Prime fell, allowed herself to hope. Because she had learned something important in that hangar. She had learned that there were beings in the universe who would stop everything for a stranger's tears. Beings who would stand between the powerful and the powerless, even when it cost them everything. Beings who saw value where others saw only tools. She had learned that humans were capable of something she had almost forgotten existed. Kindness. And kindness, she was beginning to understand, might just be the most powerful force in the galaxy.